I am NetMoverSitan. Welcome to the Star of the City lore section. Some of the most dangerous individuals within the city will be covered in this. The stars of the city shine brighter than most things in that city. The highest designation that the Hana Association, the ones in charge of the other associations and their affiliate offices, along with the fixers that are a part of both, can give something. These are some of the most dangerous groups that are known to those dwelling in that living hell. Although it is known for a star to fall, such as the Blood Red Knight. Well, at least that's what they believed, but the footage on that warp train would appear to say otherwise, wouldn't it? Firstly, we have the Warm-Hearted Woodsman. Chesed had to fight another from this twisted take on the Wizard of Oz. This time, it's of the Tin Man. In the story, he wanted to have a heart and travels with a certain girl from Kansas, along with others, to the Emerald City to get one from the wizard. In the twisted version, he was given a lead heart and was ridiculed by the wizard. He then proceeded to butcher the wizard in a violent way and then felt something from the act. It was his first murder for a heart, but not the last. Think Aztec priest doing this gruesome act to the lumberjack song that takes the out of the Canadian lumber industry. And you'll get the idea of what it's like for the warm-hearted woodsman. As for that song, we can thank Sheffield for bringing us the one that delivered that. In the facility, he killed any employee when the Quevoth counter was down to 0. And he'd escaped to kill others for their hearts after that. In the library, however, under normal circumstances, he considers his lead heart to be stiff and cold, which was too much for him. That empty and lonely feeling, the grief overwhelming to him caused by his empty chest. He required something to fill the void within. Not giving a about the woman that said that machines were built to serve humans, machines not needing a heart. Hard to know who he was talking about. If it was Carmen, then she was likely caught up in the anti-AI propaganda, meaning that she's not entirely a good person, but better than most. Ironic, considering. Well, it's unlikely to be Angela, as I'd expect that she'd be one of the last to say that. Unless this was before she snapped and, as Fleetwood Mac would put it, she went her own way. When he's acquiring a warm heart, he takes in the sensation of having this. He is motivated by how loud the heart echoes. He feels the kindness. Yeah, right. Of the previous owner of the heart, proportionate to the warmth of it. He even feels capable of laughter. While he has a warm heart, it doesn't stop him from feeling motivated to cut down trees, regardless of his efforts doing all. Unfortunately, he still feels cold, regardless of how many hearts he crams inside him. Nothing seems enough, even though he feels his chest pounding from the hearts that he possessed. As for what Chesed had to say about this, he noted that the warm-hearted woodsman's chest was still hollow, even questioning what made him. His assistant librarians noted that he still craved a warm heart to fill that void within. One even joked about another was a pretty warm-hearted person, much to the annoyance of the one it was directed at, calling them Sionbei and telling them not to use gallows humour like that and get on with the fight. One of them even considered the warm-hearted woodsman to be a sad sight upon defeating him. One didn't feel right taking his heart, and the other didn't really have any sympathy for a murderous axe-wielding killer robot. The warm-hearted woodsman's stage was consisting of a forest with a dirt path surrounded by grass, with trees in the background. Well, obviously. Each of them having eyes and flesh, implying that something gruesome occurs that makes them what the woodsman harvests, specifically harvesting their hearts from, as some were cut down, leaving only blood-covered tree stumps. The fewer details we know about that process, the better. After the warm-hearted woodsman went the way of the scarecrow searching for wisdom, Roland arrived on the floor of social sciences, which, as he expected, was full of the scent of coffee. That day's blend was Indigo Mountain, which, based on my research, appeared to be from Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. I don't know what that's like in this world, based on what this city in Korea is like. But it's likely to be worse than it is in our world. Chesed then explains, as Roland was about to sample it, that coffee can vary in flavour based on a number of factors, such as the location where it's grown, how long it's roasted, when the flavour isn't extracted, and how fine the coffee beans are ground. That last one determines how acidic and sweet the coffee is. In this case, the blend that Roland had drank was described as pretty delicate. Chesed compared it to the denizens of the city in a way, where a person's identity and values can vary depending on where they were born and raised. If they were in a nest, they'd have the worries of getting a decent enough job to not be dumped in the back streets. If in the back streets, the focus is simple survival, defending against syndicate thugs, along with the sweepers, and then working yourself to death with hours that would be considered excessive even by Japanese standards, just so that you don't starve to death sooner? Well, that is, if you're not a fixer, or part of one of these syndicates. Yeah, it's a pretty rough background there regardless, compared to a nest. It can also depend on which district you're in, as if you're a tone-deaf noise polluter in District 9, you're much as if you're a lethal chef in District 23, the streets of flavour, you might as well see about signing up with a fixer office affiliated with the She Association, as you'd make a decent assassin with how lethal your dishes are. If you don't become an ingredient of a dish yourself. This makes sense to Roland. But then he had a question for Chesed, asking what he meant by each person having a different flavour, afraid that he's been brewing coffee out of guests. As that's something that's more typical of a District 23 resident to say. Thankfully, he didn't mean it in that way. Although Roland was only half joking about that, as that could be a possibility. Then Chesed went on about blending, the technique of mixing coffee with different origins into a single cup. This can make even a low-quality coffee have a nice flavour. Comparing blending to sociology, which, according to Roland, is the study of managing a society where all kinds of people are blended together. In this case, when blending coffee, it involves filtering out the unwanted and leaving only the beans that achieve the desired flavour. But it's not as simple with people, as they have their own desires, preferring to go down a more luxurious path, even though the same outcome is reached in the end. The city and the nest does what it can to lure the good beans there, all to supplement the most unique flavour. The sales talk about the nest states that this is where you can find the true value of life. Well, considering what District 12's nest is like now, life there is worthless. And even with a nest of a wing that hasn't fallen, it's a bad joke, as the nest dwellers parade their prosperity and comforts, while the back streets have all of those that were filtered away. Or to be less charitable, those parts got stuck with the leftovers. Both the accepted and the rejected. They were deceived into selling themselves, not knowing that the nest had its own variety of hell. Roland believed otherwise. He didn't care if it was a facade. He saw life in the nest as much better than life in the back streets. Well, in some ways, it is. In other ways, it's just different at best. And at worst, if you don't contribute and keep up with expenses, your time there will be shorter than the temper of a sociopath after someone said no to them. Chesed sees it my way as the wings are grinding people up, just not literally like beans in a coffee factory, where it's all false advertising that the wings give the message that the nest that they're in charge of is the most comforting place in the world. They say this to draw in feathers. And much like the sirens from Greek myth, appearing as physically attractive, scantily clad girls with huge breasts to a group of perverts in order to lure them in, it usually works. And like that Greek myth, it results in a messy end. Messy, gore-filled, and likely painful. Each nest has its own rules. The back streets of each district are a distorted version of the policies of each wing. They all spread the same kind of lie that everyone seems to be ready to believe. Well, almost everyone. It's a self-deception that what they're doing is for the best. Yeah, best for whom? Self-serving wing executives that don't give a about anyone but themselves and those that they want to impress. Sadistic authoritarian rulers that send a claw, a cybernetic and chemically augmented force of destruction to execute those found guilty of tax evasion? Never mind anything worse? Organized crime syndicates that rival the wings in power and amorality? Those that maintain an uneasy truce with the nests and only make a move on them when that wing falls. In fact, the wings even utilize these syndicates for more unofficial business. Any wing that does this is unlikely to be scared of doing this. In fact, they'd probably be more scared of getting caught doing this. Well, most of the time. Most of the time, the head simply doesn't care, as it likely keeps them under control. In combination with using the sweepers. Roland is one of those that believes this lie, that there's no better option than to leave the back streets, join a wing, and spend a stable life in the nest. Roland, have you forgotten what's currently happening in the nest of District 12? As in where you are in the middle of? What about the J-Corp drones? MO Noah? Forget about them? And then there's the warp cleanup agents, where it's a constant battle in all those cases to not get fired, and that's if they don't get killed. Jessed asked who got to decide how to blend people. He even asks if it's necessary in the first place to pick out specific people rather than live as they are. Roland doesn't believe that life is as simple as that, as questions like that can only get you more questions. Jessed asked if that was so. Roland believes so, and thanks him for the coffee. Then he left until the next book delivery. Yeah, Roland is one that just stops asking the important questions and simply believes. I know, too much responsibility to do otherwise, isn't it? Next we have the funeral of the dead butterflies. Now this butterfly-headed abnormality had a purpose: to return dead employees back to their homes, to their families, where the only way to leave was to resign. Now, which you might think is terminating employment, but in reality, their lives are terminated, and they're doomed to stay inside, even in death. Apparently, this abnormality is a reference to Grave of the Fireflies, a Studio Ghibli film. Me. No, it's just a reference, so it's not another one that's in the wrong section. This doesn't have to be something that I should have moved to the anime-themed abnormality section in the Lobotomy Corporation Law series. He observed that people would believe that they'd become beautiful beings with small wings when they died. Yeah. They also have a halo as well. Have you heard of that? His coffin is a tribute to those that can't go anywhere, the memory of an empty faith. Well, the city is a place full of religious cults that are either scams or full of lunatics. So, not off by much, are you? He also believes that he's there to help liberate others from tormenting each other. He is there to pay respect for those suffering from grief. When he uses his lament mass attack, he questions where they go in death, noting how people lament early. As for what Yesod thinks, he understands how this abnormality exploits vulnerability. He's dispassionate with its defeat. As for his assistant librarians, they mention that the butterflies are cold to the touch, along with mentioning how many have laid down in that coffin. How many employees, to be more precise, and how the butterfly swarm sends a chill down their spine. Still feeling the chill after freeing the last librarian of the floor of technological sciences. The funeral of the dead butterfly stage is a black and white open field with a hilly background. The sky is in a butterfly wing design with silhouettes of dead bodies on the floor, along with butterflies on them. During the battle, this abnormality wields his black and white finger guns against his enemies, along with the power of black and white butterflies, some bigger than others, which aims to slow and disable his targets. But Yesod was able to figure it out through the analysis of his attack patterns. He was able to prevail against it. Next we have Letitia. This abnormality either looks like a killer doll or a child, who had friends where she was from, which were hidden inside gifts that she gave others as part of a prank. When the friend comes out of this gift, unfortunately, it's about as lethal as the process of the xenomorph life cycle, and just as messy, in the form of spider-like creatures. She apparently came to the facility voluntarily, drawn to the dark atmosphere of it. She wanted to cheer them up, in her own way. In the facility, if that employee that works on a different abnormality after working on her, the gift will go chestburster on that employee. In the library, however, she has more humanoid friends to help her fight. At least to begin with. Normally, she doesn't want to leave her friends behind, believing that only meanies hurt friends and shouldn't fight each other. She believes that the librarians will be surprised, not wanting to spoil it. She wants the librarians to play with her and her friends. She gets excited when more friends appear, as it would get livelier, full of laughter, hoping to find lots of friends, wanting feedback on her lethal prank. Happy that they want to be her friend too. When all of her friends are dead, she doesn't like it. And when the librarians aren't smiling, well, the risk of death can do that to them. She worries about where her friends went, worrying that they hate her, wanting the librarians to be her friend instead, desperate for them to accept. Yeah, loneliness can be a killer, just not in the same way as it is with Letitia. As for Hode, she felt sorry for her and thought it could work out, and felt guilty about taking her out. Her assistants, on the other hand, wanted to use her hospitality regarding friends to their advantage, although they didn't want her gifts, for obvious reasons. Although the thought of a monster wanting to be a friend is appealing to at least one of them, even though her innocent appearance can be scary and outright creepy. Letitia's stage is quite disturbing, made up of bright-coloured flesh, with a dark floor that has a red lining. There are hearts of varying sizes on the wall, resembling her gifts, along with the eyeballs of what I presume to be her spiders. Her battle is about weakening the librarians. Assisted by her gift-wrapped friends, previous victims that, when dead, turn into spiders known as wee witches' friends, which are mostly about to bleed. All but the spiders are about delivering gifts. In fact, I think these spiders actually want to take the gifts from those that have them. Next we have Ruina. This six-legged, brim hat-wearing, factory defects version of something from My Little Pony had precise standards in the facility, as if the result was too good or not good enough, she breached and killed people by breaking their minds and covering them with pink flower petals. A representation of either the coming of spring or the passing of autumn. It was confused, unsure if it was a human or a doll, caught in a cycle of turning to dust and reforming. It was apparently based on a German myth involving a witch performing an act of sexual deviancy with a mandrake root, which was apparently made by the seed or the blood of a hanged man under the gallows, depending on which version you're thinking of, which produced soulless offspring that lacks feelings. And no, contrary to what you might believe, they don't have ginger hair. The hair colour of someone is no indicator of whether or not someone has a soul. Anyway, let's move on. In the library, she kills any that are staggered. This even extends to her minions, which aren't as powerful as this abnormality is, but can cause some damage if allowed to. Alrune considered that the bloom of fragrant flowers was an accompaniment to the beginning of its despair. They bloom beyond their control, never withering. It's in the same forest as others. If the scent that never goes away can be smelled, it was an invite to a gentle world, to embrace that smell. When using its mass attack, this abnormality considers the end of its atonement to be cold and gasping for breath, born from the earth, yearning to return to it as dust, along with all that breathes. Yeah. Nejak would probably consider this to be more depressed than he is, all things considering. Certainly a good match for this patron librarian. Speaking of which, Nejak knew that something was needed to understand it and complained when the aroma didn't go away. His assistants also complained about the aroma, noting how similar the smell is to the weapon EGO. They also didn't know where that deep forest is supposed to be. Even when defeated, they still get a burning smell inside their mouths from something they considered looking fancy, where the scenery was more pleasing to look at than Alrune. Alrune's stage is within a forest covered in pink flowers and wisterias. Flower petals are scattered on the grass. Thankfully, no cherry blossoms, as there's one abnormality that takes that form, and that is thankfully not there. The main difficulty of taking her down was that only the librarian that has the laurel wreath that looks similar to her EGO gift, as it was in the facility, can cause her damage. But that doesn't apply to the minions. As for the mass attack, it hit them hard, and any that ran out of HP or stagger were killed. The arts team had a cycle of receiving the laurel wreath, fighting, and then dealing with a mass attack. Enduring repeated bouts of both until the Alrune was defeated and the last librarian on the floor of art was freed. It's that time again! More anime come to life. This time from the King of Greed, formerly the magical girl of happiness. White-haired and dark-skinned. She uses her golden gauntlet to pound evil into the wall along the road of gold. Unfortunately, her desire for happiness turned into greed. She wanted more happiness for herself, at others' expense. So she sealed herself in the amber egg that she's seen in when the library was the facility. In the facility, if there was a bad result, that's when she changed into a fish-like mini kaiju form that devoured anything in front of it, and was immune to physical attacks, along with the power to warp to other parts of the facility. In the library, her form depends on how much damage is dealt. If her amber aurum, as it's known as, is damaged enough within 3 scenes, she'll emerge as a magical girl how she would have been before she turned into a Fabergé collector's wet dream. If enough damage isn't dealt to the Amber Aurum, then Phase 3 is reached early. She'll be crazy, have the makeup that wouldn't look out of place in a black metal band, and her golden gauntlet turns into a mini version of her mini kaiju form. As for her signature move, the Road of Gold, or the Road of the King, depending on which phase we're talking about, the same one used by Gebura when she lost it during the events of the Lobotomy Corporation. That's one to watch out for. As if the Fragment of Bliss isn't acquired and used against this, those hit by this will find a golden halo over their heads. Yeah, it's outright lethal. Yeah, no amount of dice rolls will be enough to protect against this. Now, how does this girl behave? This girl wielding what is likely to be the most powerful gauntlet outside of the Marvel Universe. In her normal form, she remarks that it's been a while since she fought in her magical girl form, and wanted to get started and enjoy the feeling of that. Yeah, this is a girl that loves to fight. When she prepares for the Road of Gold mass attack, she gets serious and dared her enemies to try and stop her. She's eager to charge through the amber gate gleaming with greed. If she's successful, she talks smack about the opponents, remarking on how easy it was, how much it hurts, and how much of a pushover her opponent was. If she failed to land a hit on an opponent, she remarks on how she underestimated her opponents, that she won't make that mistake again, and dared them to stop it a second time. In her corrupted form, she's more deranged with overwhelming greed, believing that her happiness was something to wish for above anyone else's. She felt hungry, ravenously hungry. She wanted to devour more, believing that a full stomach would be what would make that possible. Possible to be happy. While preparing her Road of the King mass attack, she is overwhelmed by the hunger, consumed by the desire to eat anything that might satisfy her. Hunger tainted by greed. The feeling was unbearable. If she's successful with this, she still isn't satisfied, no matter what she's eating. She desired to eat anything in her path, much like in her fish-like mini kaiju form. Only silence remained. If she failed to land a hit on an opponent during this, she'll be unable to speak coherently due to her inability to sate her hunger. As for what Tibereth thinks of this, she exercises caution, advising against reckless behavior against the King of Greed. considering her a magical girl no more upon defeating her. As for her assistants, they see the gilded splendor and recognize it, remembering how terrifying she was in her fish-like mini kaiju form as it crawled along the corridor, remembering how they ran for their lives. And I'm hardly surprised if I was met with that heading towards my general direction, I'd run the other way. Upon her defeat, they understood that they can't wish for the happiness of others without your own, considering her hardened avarice to be one thing that won't change, although they struggle to comprehend how greed can be so dazzling. As for the King of Greed's stage, it's one that appears to be a golden palace, one that makes the golden drawing room in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg look cheap-looking. It has a large door with a gemstone at the point where the frame meets. It also has a diamond patterned floor that's reflective. After withstanding multiple attempts by the King of Greed to inflict blunt force trauma, Tipref waited for Roland to deliver more books to her, which he eventually did. She reacted more patiently than last time, stating as one's mind is amplified, they undergo changes such as gaining new powers of transformation. Tipref, you're not a magical girl. For a start, you're sane. She wasn't talking about that, don't worry. She was, of course, talking about the distortion phenomenon. Finally, something Roland wants to hear about. She describes it as almost identical to how abnormalities were made by Lobotomy Corporation. This surprised Roland, as he came to the conclusion that there's no difference between the distortion and abnormalities. Thankfully, Tipref corrected him, as the process is similar but have different origins. Abnormalities weren't manifested out of a person's own will. They were created by someone else, forcibly drawing out one's ego from the deep well of their mind. Beinar made a similar comparison when she was speaking with Aeon. This was closer to the completion of the Seed of Lights. As for the distortion, however, this occurs by an individual's choice. Roland then re-evaluated his conclusion by saying that the monsters come from the hearts of humans that bring it to the surface. He understood the danger of this. The world would be up quickly if more people became distortions, which is what Adam, the insane variant of Aeon, wanted. Thankfully, it's not as simple as that, as Tipref stated that a strong motivation is required. Here's an example on a basic level. Remember the man-eating panini monster? that was probably someone that couldn't get enough of a particular Italian-style sandwich using ciabatta bread. As for Philip of the Dawn office, he became the crying children, which represented his emotional immaturity, his cowardice, and his self-deceit. It took intense and heightened emotions for him to become that fiery brimstone-wielding force of destruction. Let's give a brief recount of events, shall we? First, the Dawn office was wiped out, with him being the only survivor. Then the Wedge office was wiped out, with him being the only survivor of that battle. He then manifested a partial EGO, was near defeat and got teleported to Oswald of the 8 o'clock circus. Well, he was at the time. Where Oswald and Pluto, yesterday's promise, an affiliate of Argalia, the Blue Reverberation, drove him over the edge, and then he distorted. Yeah, the beating that the library delivered to him twice certainly didn't help much. That, and there's a variable that makes this possible. The light that Angela stole for herself. She cut it off before it could be shone for a full week. If that had happened, it wouldn't have had side effects, or at least it wouldn't be as bad. Now this intrigued Roland. Tipref then went on to say that the problem was it was stopped halfway, which made things worse than they were before it started shining on the city. Roland wanted to know how this could be reverted. Tipref told him that the light that was spread would need to be reclaimed and then shone over the city uninterrupted for a full week. Roland was doubtful that Angela would just sit and watch letting this happen. And to be honest, I'm doubtful too, based on how things have been going so far. Tipref then mentioned that Angela asked them to wait until all the light had been retrieved, as she needed it for her own plans. Roland assumed that Tipref was one of the Sephiroth that accepted Angela's plea for more time, although he questions why, as she sabotaged their plans. Why be nice to her after that? It's because, despite her being upset at Angela, she wanted to give her a chance. Roland told her that she had the patience of a saint. In that case, she's improving. Even considering that she resists the urge to snap at Angela, as the anger remained. The reason for this was because it's what Enoch would have done, to trust her a little more. That's the problem with giving it away. It doesn't end well. Roland then said that she was much stronger than him. Now that's quite something to admit coming from you, Roland. This is because he wouldn't even dream of doing the same. Long-term thinking, That's just not his thing. Well, you did say that you had nothing to lose. Tifereth then told him that he'd learned that insight when he met someone that meant much to him. Tifereth, he did. Unfortunately, she's dead now due to the distortion. Before he left, he said, "Thanks for the kind words, kid." Much to her annoyance. Yeah, chronologically, she isn't. Physically, yeah, she is. Next will be the flaw realization of the technological sciences flaw. Yeah, it'll be quite lengthy. Don't worry, it won't be all abnormalities. Until next time. Hail the rabbit!